Well, welcome to Chapter 8, chapter on prepositions and a few other odds and ends we need to cover. What's a preposition? Well, a preposition is a word that indicates the relationship between two things. It's all those little words, or at least some of those. The book is under the table. Her feet are on the chair. The ball went over his head. John came with his disciples. Jesus came after John. All the words in red are prepositions. When you have a preposition, it's important to understand two terms connected with it. In the sentence, the book is under the table. Under is the preposition. Table is called the object of the preposition. And then the entire phrase, the preposition, its object, and any modifiers, is called the prepositional phrase. The nice thing about prepositions is that they're not inflected. They change their form for other reasons, but there's no inflection to learn. So that makes them easy. The thing that makes prepositions a little more difficult is that there's a certain relationship that exists between a preposition and an object. And if you can understand it conceptually, they're not that big of a deal, but you need to understand there's an additional thing you have to look at when you come to a preposition. The meaning of a preposition depends upon the case of its object. In other words, when you hit a preposition, you generally have to stop, go find its object, which comes right after it in almost every case, and look at its case, and then come back and translate the preposition. There are some prepositions that have an object that's always in the same case. For example, the preposition en, epsilon nu, always is followed by an object in the dative case. And when you hit those kind of prepositions, you don't have to go look at the case of its object because you know it's always going to be dative. Okay, those are easy. There are some prepositions whose objects will be in one of two cases, and there are even some prepositions whose objects will be in one of three cases. So, for example, let's say you hit the preposition meta, and you stop and you go and you look at its object. If its object is in the genitive case, then you come back and you will translate meta as with. But when you hit meta and you go look at the case of its object and it's accusative, then you come back and you translate the preposition after. Although I hold most of the verbal grammar to chapter 15, well, we're going to learn a little bit more about verbs here. Verbs have person and number. The number is the easy part. Verbs are either singular or plural. If the subject is singular, it'll have a singular ending. If the subject is plural, the verb will have a plural ending. But there's a thing called person. And first person is defined as the person speaking, which in the singular is, in English, is I or me. In the plural, first person is we. Second person is the person being spoken to. So in the singular, the second person pronoun is you, and the second person plural pronoun is y'all. All right. Yeah, it's you, and except in the South, you don't differentiate in English between singular and plural of the second person. Y'all is a great expression. And then third person is everything else. So verbs indicate person and they indicate number. And they indicate them by the ending that's placed on the end of the word. Now here's why this is so important. A verb agrees with its subject in person and number. In other words, if the subject of a sentence is I, then you'll have a first person singular form of the verb. If the subject is you, plural, then you'll have a second person plural ending on the verb. And if it's anything else, if it's rock, boat, he, she, or it, they, anything else, then the verb will have a third person form. Now what we saw in chapter 6 is that because the verb agrees with its subject, it's going to be the same person and the same number, you don't often have to have an express subject. And so if there is nothing in the nominative, you can assume the subject from the verb and supply it. So what I'm trying to do today is to go a little further and say, not only is the subject assumed in the verb, but that there's always going to be agreement between the form of the verb and its subject. So that's why, on your normal paradigm, you have 6 forms for a word. Me means I am. A, with a smooth breathing and a circumflex, that's important, means you are. And st or estin, the new is in parentheses because sometimes it's there, sometimes it's not. Doesn't matter. Same word. St or estin means he, she, or it is. You move into the plural. Esmin is we are. Este is y'all are, or you are. And ac or asin, again the new is optional, means they are. Other than having to know the form of me and the concept behind it, there's one other thing that's really important to learn about the verb me. Now this is a characteristic of me. It's not a characteristic of most verbs. If you have a normal verb, what follows the verb is its direct object, that which receives the action of the verb, and the direct object is put in the accusative case, right? Me, because of what it means, doesn't take a direct object. The word that follows me is telling you something about its subject. The Bible is big. See, big is not a direct object. In grammarian's term, it's predicating something about the subject. The Bible is big. In a sense, the verb is, or me, kind of puts an equal sign between two parts. Because of the meaning of me is never followed by a direct object in the accusative. It's always followed by a predicate nominative, which means that the word that follows it is going to be in the nominative case. It will not be in the accusative case. So in the sentence, theos estin kurios, theos is nominative, kurios is nominative, and it means God is Lord. 2 more things. Grammatically, a dependent clause is a clause that is dependent upon a main verb. In other words, a dependent clause cannot stand on its own. It's not a complete sentence. So if you have, in order to study, that can't be a sentence, can it? It's not a subject and a main verb. So it's a dependent clause. So you have to have something else like, I'm going to the library in order to study. Okay, so a dependent clause is a group of words that contain a thought, but don't, and this is the important part, they don't contain the main verb and the main subject. In other words, as you're translating and as you're trying to find the main verb and its subject, as soon as you hit hati, or you hit hina, or you hit a preposition, you know that the phrase that's introduced by those words cannot contain the main verb and the main subject. And so what you need to do is to find the end of the phrase, and then if you haven't found the verb by then, maybe it's going to come after it. But in the phrase itself, you can't have the main verb and the main subject. And I have good news for you. You now know 1 out of every other word in the New Testament. Now this rate is going to drop pretty quickly. But now if you open up your Greek Bible, you know every other word in it. Pretty cool, huh?